Week 11 tutorial activities. So these tutorial activities basically focus on designing user interfaces based on lecture 10, user interface design. So I have given some notes for you to read. Please make sure you read these notes before you move into the tutorial questions. So there are a bunch of questions, paragraphs regarding this particular it actually help for you to understand the questions before we move into the questions. So it's much more better you read this before we move into the questions. Right, so let's go through these theory questions. I think there are around 13 theory questions. So let's go through this. So the first question is, why is the interface design often refers to as a dialogue design, right? So what is the reason? The user interface actually involves, it's a kind of a communication between the user and the computer or the application, right? So which is much like a kind of a dialogue between two persons, isn't it? So one of the methods, remember the one of the methods of designing the user interface is called a dialogue method. That's what we are using when we design the user interface, right? So that is why we call the user interface is kind of a dialogue, right? It's a dialogue between the user and the computer, exactly the same like the dialogue between the two people, right? So we are mimicking that when we design the user interfaces. So that's the answer to the first question, right? It's a kind of a communication between the user and the computer. That's what we mean by often we refer to as a dialogue. The second question is asking what are some examples of physical, perceptual, and conceptual aspects of the user interface, right? So the physical aspects of the user interface, already we know that physical aspects are the physical things in the user interface like keyboards, mouse, maybe touch screen, maybe again the reference manuals, any documents, data entry forms, etc., etc. All these are kind of physical aspects of user interface. Okay, and then and the perceptual aspects are, or maybe we can say, all the data on the screen that it displays is a perceptual, right? Or the shapes, or the lines, numbers, words, or any sounds, beeping sounds, clicks, menus, dialog boxes, icons, any drawings, everything is a perceptual part of user interface. And then the conceptual aspect of user interfaces include everything the user knows about the using the system, right? All the things in the problem domain, like all the entities that we are using in the problem domain, what is actually user trying to manipulate using the application. These are the conceptual parts, right? And then the operations that can be performed using the user interface is a part of a conceptual, and also the procedures followed to carry out the operations by the user also kind of we can say it's also part of the conceptual aspect. So any user interface, we have these three things: physical part, perceptual part, and a conceptual part. So that's what the answer to the question 2 says. Okay, right. Then the question 3 is asking, what is the technique that shows a sequence of sketches of display screen during the dialogue, right? So so once we design the use case descriptions, and then system sequence diagrams together with activity diagram. Then we design the dialogue, right? And then after the dialogue, we go to the storyboarding technique to design a kind of a screens. That's what we mean by that. What is this is the answer for that, right? So sequence of sketches of display screens during the dialogue can be shown in the storyboarding technique, right? By way of a kind of a screens. That's the answer for that question. Then the question 4 is asking what are the some inputs controls that can be used to select an item from the list, right? So I think you already knows that, right? So what are the input controls that can be used to select items in the list? Now remember, one of the key things is we need to minimize the user typing the information, so we can use the other things to control the selections, right? We can use list boxes, combo boxes, right? Radio buttons, check boxes, right? So we can all use these things to control the inputs from the user, okay? Or sometimes we can group the controls in grouping all these some familiar controls in using check boxes in a one group, another radio buttons in a one group, right? So all these are the input controls, right? So that's the answer to this question. And then the question number 5, they ask what are the different considerations for the output screen design and output report design. So there are two things: output screen design, output report. Reports are printed versions, right? So what are the different considerations? So if you think about the output screens, now if the information displays on the screen, probably they are more dynamic. But the problem is we have limited information available at one time, because then we need to go through the different screen to um, grab that more and more information. But if you compare to the printout, isn't it? It is harder to view the multiple pages at the same time with the screen output, because we have a limited screen size or limited space sometimes. But the advantage of this output screen is a dynamic feature, right? We can drill down the information, right? When we click the some portion or one part of the screen, we can actually go a more deep dive into the more and more information, right? We can provide summarize information, does not actually without showing kind of more information. So we can go more summarized versions when you're clicking and deep diving. But when it comes to the printed output, is more kind of more permanent, right? And it should always include identifying fields such as date, printed, etc., etc. And then the main disadvantage is these screens are not dynamic, and therefore it has to be self-contained, and we need to include all the necessary information to be understandable, right? So that's the main consideration we need to think about. So we need to think about where to design output screens, or where to design the report, right? Because if when it comes to the management decisions, probably sometimes the reports are important, but sometimes output screens are important, so they can drill down more and more summarize information. Um, and then the other important thing we need to think about is where we going to design the input screen, because if it is a small laptop or more handheld devices, probably we may revert back to more permanent printed output rather than having that, because we have very limited capacity to display the information. Right, so that's the answer to the question number 5. These are the consideration, okay? So the question number 6 is asking what is meant by the user experience and how does the user interface relate to it. Now remember, user experience and user interface are two different things. So user experience consists of all the aspects of person's interaction with the application, isn't it? Um, so it can include, it not only include the kind of an actions and responses by the system, but also it actually include all the aspects with related to the user's attitudes, perceptions, their feelings, right? So when you design in the user interfaces, we need to think about all these things: attitude, perception, feeling of the particular users. When you do that, right, that's very important. That's it actually impact the productivity of the application as well. But when it comes to user interface, it's kind of a sets of input, output, and controls, text boxes, etc., etc., right? So that the user can use to utilize to perform his or her tasks. So that is what we mean by the user interface means. Um, so the elements on the screen in the user interface and how easy to understand all these elements can influence the user's experience greatly, right? That is how the user experience come into play when you design user interface. That's the connection between user interface and the user experience, because it actually impact our perceptions, our feelings, how we design these elements in the screen. Okay, so that's the that is basically a difference between user interface and the user experience, right? That's the answer to question 6. So the question 7 is asking what is meant by usability and why is it important for the user interface design. Okay, so what is meant by the usability and why it is important for the user interface design. um, Now, usability actually determines how easy a particular system can be learned, right? That's what we mean by the usability means. Easy to learn, right? Easy to learn, right? If the system is more complicated, then the usability goes down, right? Because this is very important criteria for determining the value of the user interface, right? So if poor design user interfaces actually means users has to need to put a lot of effort to learn the things, right? That's a poor design, right? So the value of your user interface determines how productive your application is. So design of the user interface should have a high usability, right? So think about that. How high usability has to be there. In other words, easy. How, it has to be very easy to learn the things through your user interface, right? But the main problem is we don't have any standard measure of the usability. So it depends on, it's very qualitative thing, right? So you need to think about when you design the user interfaces to increase the usability part as well. Okay, so that's the answer to question number 7. Then the question number 8 is asking describe each of the 4 methods for user interface design. Remember, there are 4 methods that I have, even in, if you go through my lecture notes or tutorial notes in this document, you will see there are 4 methods we need to actually use when we design the user interfaces, right? So direct manipulation method, then we have desktop method, then document method, and the dialog method. These are the 4 methods. So direct manipulation method is a method where the objects on the screen may be kind of a graphical icons and appear like the same map our operation of the our operation aspect of our real life, right? So that's what the direct manipulation method means, right? So for example, we can have a garbage bin, like, you know, we have a recycle bin, you know, see the recycle bin our in the desktop, in the windows, it's like a garbage bin, right? So the direct manipulation method is a ability of the user to take some sort of an action with these controls or other elements on the screen and have them change accordingly. That's the main use of the direct manipulation method per se, right? Or maybe we can take another example, like we can say, okay, we can say the color of the bar in our window will changes uh, the color setting as the user scrolls across the bar with the mouse, right? So we can design our screens like that. That's what we mean by the direct manipulation method means. And then the second one is a desktop method, is which a visual display of items on the screen is the same as they might appear on a desktop of the user, right? So screen might be organized or cluttered the same as the someone's desktop, right? So we can put, now this is like, looks like a page, right? So you can see this screen looks like a page. That's a kind of a desktop method, right? We can organize like a page in our desktop. And the document method is where an item might appear in a paper pages or an input paper document. And this is another example, right? A document, information appeared on like a document. Um, and then the dialogue method means, as I mentioned before, it's a practice where the computer asks a questions and the user responds back, right? Or vice versa, right? Um, so a good example might be, now if you have gone to the tax returns page in ATO, Australian Taxation Office. So it has a kind of series of pages asking questions from the user and user providing the answers to these questions, and then the pages, and one page, then here after another page comes in, depend on the user's reaction, and then the next page. So this is called the kind of dialogue method. Actually explains how the users and the application responded or interacts, right? That's the dialogue method. So these are the four methods: direct manipulation method, desktop method, document method, and the dialogue method. So please read my notes. It's already given in top of this page. So that is the answer to question number 8. And then question number 9 says, what are the human interface objects? Give some example. Or sometimes we call it as HIO, so human interface objects. So human interface objects are those objects on the screen that can be manipulated or moved or changed or respond to some actions by the user, right? Uh, so remember, the labels on the reports or the forms is usually not it's not user interface object, right? We can say the text boxes, radio buttons, combo boxes. So these are the human interface objects that we can design in a screen. I think that question is very straightforward. So that's the answer to question number 9. Right, so the question number 10 is asking, describe the affordance and provide an example from your experience. What do you mean by the affordance? So affordance is where the control on the screen looks like or has a characteristic that has indicates the functions that it performs. That's what we mean by the affordance means. So one example is a small speaker, right? Speaker which is the control to adjust the volume, right? So you can see the speaker displayed in here. It actually indicates, where is that? Maybe it's on my other screen. It indicates how to control your adjust the volume. Sometimes in the documents we have kind of like, you can see here, a kind of X sort of documents. It means we close this document, right? Etc, etc. So these are the example of affordance means. Okay. And then the question number 11 is asking, how can the use case diagrams help in the design of the user interface? I think I have explained that in my before video. Use cases and use case diagrams can help in the organizing or clustering of functions together. That's how we are using it, right? So the functions can be invoked by using the menu choices, right? So therefore the clustering of menu items can be developed using information from the use cases and the use case diagrams. That's the main helpness, main thing that we can use to using the use case diagram, right? So we can basically organize our menu items by using use case diagrams. So question 12. How can a system sequence diagram help in the design of the user interface? Like in use case diagram, system sequence diagrams. Actually, system sequence diagram it's a very important part, plays a very significant role in designing user interfaces. Because it indicates when the information or the messages flow into the system and when the information is returned out of the system to the user, right? Uh, so in the most cases, these information flows are accomplished through a kind of input forms and display screens, right? That's how we are using system sequence diagrams to design user interfaces. And then the final question is asking, what do you mean by the storyboarding, right? Storyboarding, as I mentioned before, is a kind of a design technique to assist the developers or system analysts in the design of the screens and the forms based on series of steps in the business procedures. So sometimes we design first the dialogue, and then we design um, um, the storyboarding. Actually, it represents the kind of a functionalities of your business procedures or the use cases, right? So sometimes separate screens are required, but sometimes additional features are added into the same screen to gain to focus some things, or when the process is progressing, we can show that we can add more and more functionalities later on to the screen. So basically, the storyboarding helps to define how the process should be progressed, or in other words, how the use case or the business process should be progressed, and what controls are enabled or disabled in such an environment, right? So that's basically the usefulness of the storyboarding.